Before the conflict ever names itself, the world of Charles Xavier already lives under a silent distortion. It is a society that still believes in intention, persuasion, and resistance as the natural limits of human interaction. Power exists, but it is supposed to encounter friction. Desire is meant to negotiate with reality. Authority is meant to justify itself through structure, law, or charisma. This is the shared illusion that stabilizes the cultural ground on which the X-Men emerge. Xavier is born outside that illusion. In this world, minds are assumed to be private territory. Thought is treated as the final border, the one place where consent is absolute and intrusion is impossible. Everything else can be occupied, surveilled, or conquered, but the inner space remains protected by biological and social limits. The ethical systems that govern this society are built on that assumption. Morality presumes opacity. Responsibility presumes ignorance. Guilt presumes uncertainty. Xavier violates this structure simply by existing. Long before he becomes a teacher, a leader, or a symbol of coexistence, he is a pressure point in the architecture of human ethics. His power does not announce itself as violence. It does not arrive with spectacle or destruction. It arrives as access, quiet, total, and invisible. The kind of power that leaves no marks on the body and no evidence in the world, only changes in behavior that feel natural to the person experiencing them. That is where the danger begins. In the early configuration of the X-Men universe, mutation is framed as an evolutionary tension, a difference that unsettles norms but still obeys recognizable rules. Strength can be measured, energy can be contained, physical dominance can be opposed. Telepathy does not follow these patterns. It bypasses the arena entirely. It moves the conflict from the battlefield to the interior, from action to intention. Xavier understands this before anyone else does. The world around him still believes that morality begins with action, that harm requires movement, that violation requires force. Xavier lives in the space before all of that, where the decision happens, where desire forms, where resistance could exist but does not. His presence introduces a structural problem. If one individual can reach into another without resistance, then the ethical framework collapses inward. Consent becomes fragile. In most human interactions, consent is protected by difficulty. Persuasion takes time. Manipulation takes effort. Coercion leaves traces. Xavier removes the effort while preserving the appearance of choice. That is the most unsettling configuration of power imaginable. When compliance feels voluntary, but is not, morality loses its reference point. This is not a future threat. It is a constant condition. The early world of Xavier is one that still trusts appearances, trusts language, trusts education, trusts that if people speak long enough, truth will surface. Xavier builds his identity inside that belief system, but never fully belongs to it. His mind operates behind the curtain, in a space where motives are visible and defenses are transparent. He sees the gap between what people say and what moves them, between values and impulses, between ideals and fear. And he knows how easy it would be to close that gap for them. The school, when it appears, is not just an institution. It is a boundary, a territory claimed not for control, but for containment. A place where power is framed as guidance rather than command, where hierarchy is softened by mentorship, where influence is delayed, slowed down, ritualized into lessons and dialogue. The architecture itself reflects a psychological strategy. Distance instead of intimacy. Structure instead of immediacy. This is not accidental. Xavier's environment is designed to introduce friction where none is required, rules where none are needed, waiting where action would be instantaneous. The school becomes a rehearsal of restraint, a simulation of normal human limitation imposed on an abnormal capacity. He constructs a world where he must explain rather than impose, ask rather than decide, persuade rather than rewrite. The tone is deliberate, calm, rational, almost anesthetized. This calmness is often mistaken for wisdom or benevolence, but it is closer to vigilance. Xavier does not trust himself in the way ordinary people trust their impulses. He cannot afford to. His instincts are not more violent or corrupt than anyone else's. They are simply more effective. That difference changes everything. In this early equilibrium, before Magneto hardens into an opposing pole, and before open conflict defines the narrative, Xavier's struggle is internal and structural. He is not fighting an enemy. He is managing proximity, how close he can get to others without dissolving the boundary that protects their autonomy, how much he can know without acting on it, how much he can feel without intervening. The cultural myth still frames him as a benevolent mind, a guardian, a moral compass, but beneath that image is a quieter tension, the knowledge that goodness, in his case, is not proven by intention but by refusal, not by what he does, but by what he consistently does not do. The silence around this tension is what allows it to persist. The world does not ask Xavier to justify his restraint. It assumes it. It praises his ideals without examining their origin. It celebrates his advocacy for free will without questioning why free will matters so desperately to him. His philosophy is taken at face value, as if it emerged from abstract principle rather than existential necessity. That misunderstanding is foundational, because the real conflict does not begin when Xavier faces an antagonist. It begins when the audience realizes that his ethics are not universal ideals but personal safeguards, that his reverence for consent is inseparable from his capacity to violate it effortlessly, that his devotion to choice is shaped by the fact that choice, for him, is optional. This realization destabilizes the entire moral landscape of the narrative. If Xavier must work so hard to preserve autonomy, what does that say about the nature of power? If consent requires restraint from the powerful rather than protection for the vulnerable, then morality is no longer a shared contract. It becomes an asymmetrical burden, and that burden sits entirely in Xavier's mind. Before the fractures appear on the surface, before ideology splits the mutant world into camps, before violence clarifies positions, this is the true opening state. A system held together by one individual's constant self-suppression. A moral order that depends not on law or consequence, but on a single consciousness choosing, again and again, not to cross a line that only he can see. The tension is already complete. Nothing has happened yet, but everything that will happen is already implied. Charles Xavier's psychology does not begin with heroism. It begins with asymmetry. From the earliest articulation of his abilities, the imbalance is clear. He is not simply different in degree, but in category. His power does not extend the body into the world. It relocates the world into the mind. That relocation is the foundation of every value he later defends. Before ethics, before ideology, before community, there is the experience of seeing without being seen. This experience reshapes identity at its root. Most subjects discover limits early. Language fails. Authority resists. Desire meets refusal. The self learns to negotiate with others through uncertainty. Xavier never inhabits that terrain in the same way. His mind encounters transparency where opacity is expected. Motives surface unfiltered. Fear announces itself before it can disguise itself as reason. This does not produce clarity in a moral sense. It produces exposure. a continuous awareness of how fragile human intention actually is. The child who can hear thought does not grow into innocence. He grows into vigilance. Xavier's early orientation toward the world is not curiosity but caution. He learns quickly that knowing what someone thinks is not neutral. Knowledge creates pressure. Pressure invites action. The mere awareness of another's fear or longing places responsibility on the observer. To know is already to stand inside the ethical dilemma. For Xavier, ignorance is not an option. That removes the shelter most people enjoy. This is where his internal architecture begins to form. His later devotion to restraint does not emerge as a moral awakening. It emerges as a defensive adaptation, a way to survive proximity without collapsing into intervention. His values are built backward, not from ideals outward, but from danger inward. The danger is not that he might become cruel. It is that he might become efficient. Efficiency is the enemy in this psychological configuration. To understand Xavier's foundation, it is necessary to recognize that desire functions differently for him. Desire, in most subjects, is shaped by delay. Waiting intensifies longing. Obstacles refine intention. For Xavier, delay is artificial. The obstacle is self-imposed. That transforms desire into something suspect. Wanting becomes a risk factor, an impulse that must be examined before it is allowed to exist. This creates a split that will define his entire narrative presence. On one side is the impulse to connect, to belong, to be understood without translation. Telepathy offers the promise of perfect intimacy, no misunderstanding, no misalignment, no distance. On the other side is the knowledge that such intimacy would erase the other as a subject. Understanding achieved without consent is not understanding. It is occupation. Xavier chooses distance. The teacher persona emerges not as altruism, but as insulation. The classroom creates a structure where knowledge flows in one direction under socially accepted terms. It transforms invasive awareness into pedagogical authority. He can know his students, guide them, shape them, while maintaining a symbolic boundary that protects both sides. The hierarchy provides friction. Titles slow impulse. Ritual replaces immediacy. This is why his warmth is always moderated. Xavier's compassion is intellectualized. His care is procedural. He avoids emotional entanglement because emotion accelerates proximity. Where emotion intensifies, vigilance weakens. He understands this intuitively. The more he feels, the closer he gets to the threshold where restraint must fail. So he disciplines feeling itself, converting empathy into principle. That conversion is not without cost. The psychic burden of continuous self-surveillance creates an internal environment of tension rather than peace. Xavier is not serene. He is controlled. The difference matters. Serenity implies integration. Control implies division. His mind is partitioned. One part observes. Another part desires. A third part judges both. This internal triad sustains functionality, but prevents rest. It also produces blind spots. Because Xavier refuses to act openly on desire, desire does not disappear. It becomes strategic, rationalized, deferred. The shadow does not express itself as chaos. It expresses itself as exception, moments where the rule bends. Memory alterations justified as protection. Decisions made without consultation framed as necessity. These are not contradictions. They are pressure leaks. The system holds until it cannot. This foundation becomes clearer when contrasted with the figure who will later mirror and polarize him. Magneto does not need to be introduced yet as an antagonist. He functions initially as a comparative structure. Where Xavier internalizes power, Magneto externalizes it. Where Xavier builds restraint, Magneto builds assertion. But both originate from the same rupture. A world that proved hostile enough to invalidate trust and consensus. The divergence is psychological, not ideological. Xavier responds to trauma by building an internal court. Every impulse is tried, every action weighed. Magneto responds by rejecting the court entirely. Action precedes justification. Xavier sees this not as moral failure, but as temptation realized. Magneto becomes the proof of what Xavier might become if vigilance relaxes. This relationship shapes Xavier's self-image long before open conflict. He does not define himself as good. He defines himself as not Magneto. His ethics are relational, reactive, dependent on contrast. This dependence introduces fragility. When morality is constructed as opposition rather than integration, it requires the other to exist in order to remain coherent. The cultural context of the X-Men amplifies this dynamic. The narrative emerges in a period marked by anxiety around authority, surveillance, and ideological polarization. Trust in institutions is eroding. Fear of hidden influence is rising. Xavier embodies both the hope and the threat of unseen power. He is the ideal overseer who promises protection without domination. Yet the very invisibility of his influence aligns him with the anxieties of the era. This duality is not resolved. It is curated. Xavier's rhetoric emphasizes coexistence, choice, and dialogue. These values resonate culturally because they counterbalance the fear of control. But within the narrative structure, they also function as reassurance. They tell the audience that power can be benevolent if it disciplines itself. That danger can be neutralized through character. This reassurance is necessary for the myth to function. Without it, Xavier would become unbearable as a protagonist. The audience must believe in his restraint, even when evidence suggests its fragility. The narrative invests heavily in his intentions because intentions are the only visible metric available. His actions often contradict his principles in subtle ways, but the framing protects him. The moral camera remains aligned with his self-understanding. This alignment is strategic. It allows the story to explore control without naming it as such, to examine consent without exposing its structural vulnerability. Xavier becomes the figure through which the audience rehearses trust in invisible authority. He is the ideal mind because he claims not to use his advantage. The audience accepts this claim because the alternative is too unsettling. That acceptance creates tension. Because the foundation is built on belief rather than verification, every ethical choice Xavier makes carries an echo of doubt. Did he choose restraint? Or did he choose control in a quieter form? Did he allow choice, or did he curate the conditions under which choice felt inevitable? These questions linger beneath the surface, unresolved but accumulating. They shape the narrative gravity. As the world around Xavier becomes more hostile, more polarized, more explicit in its violence, his foundational strategy is tested. The friction he imposed on himself begins to feel inadequate. The slowness of dialogue starts to resemble negligence. The refusal to intervene appears less virtuous when harm accelerates. This is where the groundwork pays off. Because Xavier's ethics were never abstract, their failure is not philosophical. It is operational. The system he built to contain himself begins to strain under external pressure. And as it strains, the core question becomes unavoidable. If consent only survives because the powerful choose to honor it, then consent is not a right. It is a favor. That realization prepares the conflict. It does not erupt yet, but the ground is no longer stable. The moral architecture that sustained Xavier's identity has revealed its dependence on constant vigilance. The audience senses the weight accumulating, the knowledge that one lapse, one exception too many, could collapse the entire structure. The conflict has not begun, but its conditions are now complete. The conflict does not announce itself with violence. It begins with acceleration. The world around Xavier changes tempo, and the pace he carefully imposed on himself starts to feel out of sync with reality. Events begin to unfold faster than education can respond to. Fear spreads faster than dialogue can contain. The system that once rewarded patience now punishes hesitation. This shift exposes the first fracture. Mutants stop being an abstract future and become a visible problem. Visibility transforms difference into threat. Public attention sharpens perception, and perception amplifies fear. Xavier understands this process intuitively. He has always lived inside amplified perception. What changes now is scale. The world begins to mirror his own condition. Minds become transparent in a different way. Anxiety leaks into policy. Suspicion becomes a default setting. The arena expands beyond his control. Xavier's strategy has always depended on limited exposure. A contained environment. A school hidden from the center of power. A quiet territory where growth could occur without provoking reaction. As mutant presence becomes unavoidable, that perimeter dissolves. The school is no longer a refuge. It becomes a symbol. Symbols attract pressure. Pressure demands response. At this stage, Xavier still believes restraint can scale. He doubles down on structure. More rules. More protocols. More emphasis on discipline and training framed as responsibility rather than preparation for conflict. He speaks of coexistence with renewed urgency, not because it has become more viable, but because the alternative is approaching faster than he can admit. This is not denial. It is commitment under strain. The first decisive moments are subtle. Small interventions justified as safeguards. Quiet mental nudges to prevent panic. Selective omissions of truth to maintain morale. These acts are not framed as violations. They are framed as maintenance. The system must be kept functional. The narrative treats them as necessary adjustments. But adjustment is already intervention. What changes psychologically is not the action itself, but the threshold. Once the line is crossed internally, it becomes easier to cross again. Xavier's mind registers this shift, even if the narrative does not emphasize it. The internal court that once tried every impulse begins to operate under emergency rules. Expedience enters the chamber. This is where consent becomes procedural rather than absolute. Xavier does not openly override choice. He shapes context. He decides what information is available. He calibrates emotional states to reduce volatility. The individuals involved still experience themselves as choosing freely. That experience becomes his alibi. If no one feels violated, then no violation occurred. This logic is dangerously efficient. It mirrors the very temptation Xavier built his life to avoid. The elimination of friction, the smoothing of resistance, the quiet transformation of influence into infrastructure. His power no longer acts as force. It acts as environment. People move within it without noticing its contours. The audience begins to sense the shift. What once appeared as moral clarity now feels like managerial authority. Xavier is no longer simply guiding individuals. He is stabilizing a system. And systems do not ask permission. They optimize. They prioritize outcomes over autonomy. The ethical language remains intact, but its function has changed. This is where the parallel with Magneto sharpens. While Magneto confronts the world openly, accepting conflict as inevitable, Xavier absorbs conflict internally. He becomes the buffer, the mediator, the one who will carry the moral cost so others do not have to. This self-assigned role intensifies his isolation. He cannot share the full weight of his decisions without destabilizing the very people he seeks to protect. Secrecy becomes structural. With secrecy comes distance. With distance comes hierarchy. Xavier's authority solidifies not through fear, but through reliance. Others begin to depend on his judgment precisely because it appears measured. That dependence reinforces his position as an unseen center. A throne without ceremony, a crown without acknowledgement. Power consolidates quietly. The narrative frames this consolidation as tragic necessity. The world is hostile. Institutions are corrupt. Violence is escalating. Someone must make decisions without consensus. Xavier accepts this burden because he believes he is uniquely qualified to bear it without abuse. This belief is sincere, but sincerity does not neutralize consequence. As Xavier's internal monitoring intensifies, his external accountability diminishes. No one can fully evaluate his actions because no one can see what he sees. His perspective becomes unchallengeable, not because others agree, but because disagreement lacks access. This is the first irreversible turn. The conflict is no longer about whether Xavier will use his power. It is about how invisibly he can integrate it into the functioning of the world. Consent remains present as a concept, but it is now conditional. It survives as long as outcomes align with stability. The cost is deferred, not eliminated. At this stage, the system still holds. The audience still sympathizes. The violations are small enough to rationalize. The threats are large enough to justify compromise. The architecture of restraint remains standing, even as its foundation shifts. But the direction is set. Xavier has moved from refusing the shortcut to managing it, from denying the ease of control to embedding it beneath layers of principle. The power that once demanded constant vigilance now operates through habit. The conflict has taken shape. It will not retreat. As the system adapts to Xavier's quiet consolidation of authority, the narrative enters a phase where opposition becomes unavoidable. Not because his methods suddenly fail, but because they begin to reveal their cost. Stability achieved through invisible pressure cannot remain morally neutral once it starts shaping identity. The world does not merely calm down around Xavier's influence. It reorganizes itself. This reorganization introduces polarization. Mutants begin to notice the asymmetry. Some feel protected. Others feel constrained without understanding why. Decisions seem to resolve themselves before debate concludes. Conflicts dissolve before reaching articulation. On the surface, this appears efficient. Beneath it, agency erodes. The sense that something is being managed replaces the sense of collective participation. Xavier becomes the center of gravity. Not through declaration, but through accumulation. Each intervention leaves a residue. Each exception normalizes the next. The environment he shapes begins to expect correction. Emotional spikes soften automatically. Dissent loses urgency. Risk is smoothed into compliance. The world does not feel controlled. It feels curated. This distinction is crucial. Control provokes resistance. Curation invites gratitude. Those who benefit most from Xavier's influence become its strongest defenders. They experience relief, safety, direction. For them, consent feels intact because outcomes align with desire. This creates a moral echo chamber. Validation replaces scrutiny. Opposition, when it emerges, sounds unreasonable. Those who resist Xavier's approach struggle to articulate their discomfort. They cannot point to overt coercion. There is no visible violence to condemn. Their unease sounds abstract, philosophical, even paranoid. This weakens their position. The narrative itself frames them as reactive, impulsive, or dangerous. This is how polarization solidifies. Magneto's presence intensifies this process. His refusal to disguise power exposes the contrast. Where Xavier embeds influence, Magneto declares it. Where Xavier diffuses conflict internally, Magneto externalizes it. The audience is invited to choose between them. Order versus defiance. Stability versus confrontation. But the binary is false. Both figures exert force. They differ only in visibility. Magneto's power is theatrical. It reshapes landscapes and announces intention. Xavier's power reshapes perception and leaves no trace. The narrative privileges visibility as the marker of danger. What can be seen can be resisted. What cannot be seen becomes normalized. Xavier understands this advantage. He frames his restraint as moral superiority. He positions himself as the reasonable alternative to extremism. This positioning is effective because it aligns with cultural preference. Societies fear chaos more than subtle domination. They reward those who promise peace without disruption. The cost is absorbed silently. Psychologically, Xavier's internal division deepens. The part of him that once enforced absolute restraint now negotiates. He no longer asks whether an action violates autonomy. He asks whether the violation is detectable, whether it produces backlash, whether it prevents greater harm. This is a critical shift. Ethics move from principle to calculus. Consent becomes a variable rather than a boundary. The line he once refused to cross becomes a zone he navigates. This navigation requires constant adjustment, fine-tuning, mental labor that isolates him further from those he leads. Isolation reinforces certainty. With no external mirror capable of reflecting his full actions, Xavier's self-image stabilizes around necessity. He is no longer merely choosing restraint. He is managing inevitability. The world is too dangerous. Others are too impulsive. Someone must decide. This belief hardens into identity. The school, once a sanctuary, becomes an extension of governance. Training shifts subtly from self-mastery to readiness. Dialogue becomes instruction. Students internalize Xavier's perspective not through indoctrination, but through exposure. His worldview saturates the environment. This saturation feels organic, which makes it more powerful. At this stage, dissent becomes morally suspect. Questioning Xavier is framed as undermining unity, as risking collapse. The narrative reinforces this framing by associating opposition with escalation. Those who challenge the unseen order appear reckless. Polarization completes itself. The conflict is no longer between ideas. It is between systems of legitimacy. Visible power versus invisible power. Force versus influence. Choice versus outcome. Xavier's camp defends results. Magneto's camp defends agency. Each accuses the other of tyranny. Both are correct, but only one side controls the frame. This is where the audience's discomfort peaks. The benevolent image of Xavier strains under scrutiny. His calm authority begins to feel heavy. His silence feels strategic. The very qualities that once signaled trustworthiness now signal insulation from consequence. Yet the system persists. Because it works, violence is reduced. Panic is contained. Catastrophe is delayed. These tangible successes overshadow abstract concerns. Consent, once the foundation of moral interaction, becomes secondary to survival. The narrative does not declare this openly. It allows it to emerge through pattern. The price is paid internally. Xavier's vigilance becomes exhausting. the effort required to maintain invisible control scales with complexity. Each new crisis demands faster intervention, less consultation, more unilateral judgment. The internal court that once deliberated now rubber stamps. This is not corruption in the conventional sense. It is erosion, the kind that occurs when restraint is forced to operate under permanent emergency, the kind that transforms ethical clarity into administrative burden. Xavier does not abandon his values. He operationalizes them until their meaning thins. Consent remains present as language, absent as reality. The conflict has fully polarized. There is no return to neutrality now. The final stage of this development is not marked by a decisive act of domination, but by normalization. The system no longer feels provisional. What began as emergency measure settles into routine. Xavier's influence ceases to feel like intervention and starts to feel like infrastructure. The environment itself carries his judgment forward, reducing the need for direct action. This is where the conflict becomes structural. At this point, Xavier intervenes less often, not because restraint has returned, but because it is no longer necessary. Patterns have been established. Expectations have been calibrated. Emotional ranges have narrowed. People anticipate correction and adjust themselves preemptively. The most effective form of control is the one that teaches others to control themselves. Consent dissolves quietly here, not through force, but through habituation. Choice still exists in theory, but the cost of deviating from the curated equilibrium grows higher. Dissent feels disruptive. Emotional intensity feels irresponsible. Urgency feels dangerous. The system rewards moderation because moderation aligns with stability. Xavier becomes less visible. His presence recedes into abstraction. He is invoked rather than consulted, trusted rather than questioned. His authority no longer depends on active decision-making, but on precedent. This is the hallmark of a power that has succeeded too well. It no longer needs to assert itself to be obeyed. The irony is complete. Xavier sought to protect autonomy by refusing to dominate, yet arrives at a configuration where autonomy survives only within parameters he designed. He does not command behavior. He defines what behavior feels reasonable. The distinction is subtle but absolute. This is the point of no return, because even if Xavier were to withdraw now, the system would persist. The patterns would remain. The expectations would hold. The psychic environment has been reshaped. The territory has been occupied not by force, but by influence sedimented over time. Magneto recognizes this immediately. His opposition hardens not because Xavier has become overtly tyrannical, but because he has become unavoidable. Magneto's violence now functions as counter-visibility, a way to reintroduce friction into a world that has grown too smooth. His destruction is not only reactionary, it is diagnostic. He exposes the hidden architecture by breaking it. This reframes their conflict entirely. Magneto is no longer simply rebelling against oppression. He is rebelling against normalization, against the quiet disappearance of choice disguised as peace. Xavier, in turn, views Magneto not as a moral failure, but as an existential threat to stability itself. Their opposition is no longer ideological. It is architectural. Two systems cannot coexist. One requires visible conflict to preserve agency. The other requires invisible management to preserve order. Each claims necessity. Each produces harm. The narrative refuses to resolve this tension because resolution would require declaring one form of power legitimate. That declaration never comes. Instead, the audience is left with accumulation. a growing awareness that Xavier's greatest danger was never the possibility that he might abuse power impulsively. It was the possibility that he might use it responsibly, carefully, incrementally, until no one could remember what resistance felt like. This is the final consequence of ease. When control requires no effort, it becomes ethical by default. When consent encounters no pressure, it becomes irrelevant. Xavier does not violate minds openly. He removes the need to do so by shaping the conditions under which minds operate. The conflict has fully matured. There is no villain to defeat, no choice that restores balance, only a system that now functions exactly as designed. Efficient, calm, stable, and profoundly compromised. The narrative moves forward not toward resolution, but toward permanence. The cost has been absorbed into the structure. The world continues. So does the question, not whether Xavier could control minds, but whether anyone should be trusted not to. Once the conflict reaches this stage, it no longer belongs to Charles Xavier alone. It detaches from individual intention and embeds itself in culture, in myth, in the shared language through which power is imagined and justified. Xavier ceases to function merely as a character. He becomes a symbolic apparatus, a model through which modern audiences rehearse their relationship with invisible authority. The cultural resonance of Xavier rests on a paradox that feels uncomfortably familiar. He represents power that promises safety without spectacle, order without brutality, control without humiliation. In a media environment saturated by overt domination, his restraint feels ethical by contrast. The absence of visible violence is misread as absence of coercion. This misreading is not accidental. It is culturally trained. Modern societies are more comfortable negotiating with systems than with individuals. A system feels impartial, distributed, rational. Xavier's influence mirrors this preference. He does not rule through charisma or fear. He rules through architecture, through norms, expectations, emotional climates. He becomes the unseen administrator of psychic space. This is why he remains sympathetic even as his actions become questionable. Culturally, the fear of chaos outweighs the fear of subtle domination. Disorder is loud. It demands attention. Invisible control dissolves into the background. It becomes part of how things are. Xavier embodies the fantasy that someone could manage complexity without corrupt intent. That intelligence could substitute for consent. That wisdom could replace friction. This fantasy is deeply seductive. It allows audiences to outsource moral labor. If someone is watching, correcting, stabilizing, then individual vigilance becomes unnecessary. Anxiety is reduced. Responsibility diffuses. The cost is not immediately felt because it is not immediately paid. It is deferred into abstraction. Xavier's myth thrives on that deferral. The cultural framing consistently positions him as the counterweight to extremism. His opposition to Magneto anchors his legitimacy. By juxtaposing invisible control against visible violence, the narrative trains the audience to associate danger with disruption rather than manipulation. The spectacle of destruction distracts from the quiet occupation of territory. This dynamic mirrors real cultural patterns. Societies often tolerate intrusive systems as long as they reduce overt conflict. Surveillance justified by safety. Influence justified by stability. Guidance justified by expertise. Xavier becomes the psychological figurehead of this logic. He reassures the audience that restraint can be trusted because it comes from intelligence rather than impulse. The problem is not that this reassurance is false. It is that it is incomplete. Xavier's symbolic function depends on the invisibility of his violations. As long as consent feels intact, it is treated as intact. The subjective experience of choice becomes the metric. Structural influence disappears from consideration. This is where cultural blind spots emerge. Power that operates beneath awareness escapes moral scrutiny. The X-Men narrative does not explicitly condemn this blindness. It reflects it. This reflection is why Xavier endures. He allows audiences to engage with uncomfortable questions without fully confronting them. He externalizes the dilemma. If someone else bears the burden of restraint, then the audience can remain ethically passive. Yet the discomfort persists. It surfaces in moments where Xavier's actions feel too convenient. Memory alterations that preserve harmony. Emotional calibrations that prevent conflict. Decisions made without consultation that somehow align with collective good. These moments create unease precisely because they lack drama. There is no rupture to react to. Cultural myths prefer rupture. They are built around climaxes. Villains defeated. Lines crossed. Redemption achieved. Xavier's story resists this structure. His most consequential actions occur off-screen, in silence, in justification. This makes him harder to resolve and harder to reject. The symbolic field expands beyond the narrative. Xavier becomes a stand-in for institutions that claim neutrality, for leaders who promise protection without force, for systems that shape behavior by shaping environment. His presence invites the audience to ask a question rarely articulated directly. If control feels benevolent, does it still require consent? The answer remains unresolved. This unresolved tension allows different audiences to project different values onto Xavier. For some, he is the ideal guardian, proof that power can be ethical if disciplined. For others, he is a warning, evidence that restraint can mutate into domination when unaccountable. Both readings coexist because the narrative supports both. This duality is not a flaw. It is the engine of Xavier's cultural longevity. He functions as a mirror rather than a message. What one sees in him reveals one's tolerance for invisible influence, one's relationship with authority that feels reasonable. The symbolic terrain he occupies is one of contested space. Territory is not conquered through force, but normalized through presence. The center holds not because it repels challengers, but because challengers appear irrational by comparison. Xavier's authority becomes the default setting. Deviation from it requires justification. This is how myths maintain power. They do not argue. They frame. Within this frame, Magneto becomes the necessary disruption. His extremism clarifies Xavier's moderation. His violence legitimizes Xavier's calm. The cultural narrative relies on this polarity to stabilize meaning. Without Magneto, Xavier's influence would appear oppressive. Without Xavier, Magneto's resistance would lack context. Together, they form a closed circuit. The audience is invited to choose sides, but the choice itself reinforces the system. Either option accepts the premise that power must be exercised. The debate is about method, not legitimacy. This is a crucial symbolic containment. It prevents deeper questioning. The deeper question remains buried. What happens when consent is structurally unnecessary? Xavier's power exposes the fragility of autonomy in a world where influence precedes awareness. He represents a future where persuasion is optimized, where disagreement is managed, where emotional volatility is treated as a bug rather than a signal. This future is not dystopian in appearance. It is orderly, calm, functional. That is what makes it unsettling. Culturally, we are trained to fear tyranny when it announces itself. We are less equipped to recognize it when it arrives as care. Xavier's myth exploits this gap. He embodies the fantasy that someone could oversee the system without becoming the system. The narrative never confirms this fantasy. It only sustains it. This sustenance allows Xavier to function as a moral placeholder, a figure through whom audiences negotiate their comfort with influence that feels earned. His intelligence legitimizes his authority. His suffering humanizes his restraint. His isolation frames his decisions as sacrifice. The cost is aestheticized, and so the conflict persists not as a question of right and wrong, but as a tension between visibility and invisibility, between force that can be resisted and influence that cannot. Xavier's symbolic meaning crystallizes here. He is not the answer to the problem of power. He is the question made stable. His cultural impact lies in how thoroughly he normalizes the idea that control can be ethical if it is quiet enough, that consent can be preserved if violation is gentle, that freedom can coexist with management as long as it feels voluntary. This idea does not resolve. It circulates. It becomes part of the collective imagination, a myth that does not conclude but repeats. Each retelling reinforces the ambiguity. Each generation inherits the tension without closure. That is the true legacy of the conflict at this stage. It escapes the narrative and enters the culture, and it stays there. What remains after the conflict stabilizes is not resolution, but sediment. The narrative does not close around a lesson or a verdict. It leaves behind a structure that continues to operate, largely unquestioned, because it no longer feels provisional. Xavier's legacy is not a triumph or a failure. It is a configuration, a way power learned to inhabit the world without announcing itself. By the time this stage is reached, the question of intent has lost relevance. Xavier's personal morality no longer determines the ethical state of the system. His vigilance, once the central safeguard, has been absorbed into routine. The architecture persists independently of his moment-to-moment choices. Even doubt, if it appears, arrives too late to reverse what has already been normalized. This is the most enduring consequence of his path. Xavier set out to ensure that power would never replace choice. What he achieved instead was a world in which choice survives only within parameters shaped by unseen influence. No command is issued. No mind is overtly seized. Yet behavior aligns. Emotional ranges compress. Dissent becomes costly without ever being forbidden. Freedom exists, but it exists inside a field already calibrated. The tragedy is not personal. It is structural. Xavier does not fall into corruption in any dramatic sense. There is no moment where the audience can point and say this is where he became something else. That absence is essential to the myth. It reassures. It allows the belief that ethical erosion must always be visible. That tyranny announces itself. That harm wears a recognizable face. Xavier's legacy denies that comfort. He demonstrates that the most consequential ethical shifts occur when nothing seems to be happening, when systems quietly succeed, when outcomes improve while autonomy thins. The calm after conflict becomes the most dangerous terrain of all because it discourages scrutiny. Peace becomes proof. Stability becomes justification. In this aftermath, Magneto's role is fixed permanently as antagonist, even when his warnings align with the underlying truth. His violence disqualifies his insight. His visibility invalidates his critique. History remembers him as a threat because history prefers threats it can identify. Xavier, by contrast, becomes memory's guardian, the one who held things together. This is how myths choose sides. The cultural record frames Xavier as a moral anchor precisely because his control never fully ruptured the surface. His mistakes are contextualized, his violations reframed as burdens. his secrecy recoded as responsibility. Over time, even the tension that once surrounded him fades into reverence. But the question does not disappear. It lingers beneath the reverence, resurfacing whenever authority claims benevolence without transparency, whenever systems promise protection without participation, whenever expertise replaces consent. Xavier's figure is invoked implicitly in these moments, not as a warning, but as reassurance. Someone competent is watching. That reassurance is his true afterlife. The legacy is not that Xavier controlled minds, but that he proved control could be normalized if it felt reasonable enough, if it reduced harm, if it spared people the discomfort of choice under pressure. His story teaches that consent can erode not through force, but through relief. People relinquish agency most easily when doing so feels like care. This realization is what keeps the conflict alive, because the system Xavier helped build does not collapse when he is removed. It has trained its inhabitants. It has reshaped expectations. It has defined what stability looks like. Even absence becomes presence. Even restraint becomes habit. There is no return to a prior state. The aftermath is not emptiness. It is continuity. The world moves forward carrying the imprint of decisions made quietly, justified carefully, and never fully confronted. The myth remains intact because it offers no obvious villain to reject, only a mirror that reflects the audience's own tolerance for invisible influence. Xavier's final position in the cultural imagination is not as a tyrant or a saint, but as a necessary discomfort that never fully resolves. He embodies the unsettling truth that ethical systems depend not on power itself, but on who holds it and how little they need to use it. His story does not warn against control. It warns against ease. When control becomes effortless, consent becomes fragile. When influence becomes ambient, resistance becomes irrational. When stability becomes sacred, freedom becomes negotiable. These dynamics do not end with Xavier. They extend outward, quietly shaping how authority is imagined long after the narrative concludes. That is why the conflict never truly ends. It settles and continues operating,